Right, so I want to wind one full turn of tension onto that film advance lever, film advance shaft, so that the film advance lever will return to the rest position promptly. So first I'm going to lift the lock lever out of the way. I'm going to get this propped on my all-purpose block of wood. Hold back the release lever. Rotate the film advance one full turn clockwise. Drop my lock lever and release lever back in position to hold it there. Now, being very careful not to touch the release lever, the lock lever or release lever on the table while I'm doing this. I'll put the base plate in place and fit the screws that hold that in position. These are all nickel plated screws. There are two screws that are chrome plated, go in the top cover. Don't mix them up. It's not uncommon to find cameras with the chrome plated screws hidden in the base plate and nickel plated screws on the top, or if somebody had recognised their mistake, chrome plated screws in the base plate and new replacement chrome plated screws in the top cover. I'll get those three in place because that's all I need for the moment. Put the advance lever in place. I'm still being careful not to put the camera down on the bench. I do not want to knock the release lever or the lock lever because that'll allow the film advance to unspool. Now the lever's in place, that can't happen. So that's safe. That moves smoothly. I'll put these other screws in the chrome trim. One of these screws is quite rough looking. That would be the one that was a fight to get out of the camera. I think that the problem must have lay with the screw rather than the camera body, because the screw I put in that position went in without any argument. So let's have a look at this ugly screw. The thread doesn't look good in it, I'm just going to replace that. Here's a tidy looking replacement for my vast collection of leftovers. And the ugly one we'll throw to one side. Okay, so with the film advance lever present, we press down the release shaft. That released here. If I hold down the lock shaft, the lock lever, film advance moves smoothly. Returns to the rest position. That's good. At the top of the camera, I've got to be careful not to lose that. I don't want that shutter release falling out. So I'll be careful not to tip the camera upside down. So at the top of the camera, at this stage, we just about have our chrome trim plate back in place, I think. I'm going to lock up the two screws on the top of the film advance, get them nice and tight now. This plate goes on here. The strap lug at this end can go in place. There are two screws for that. Just find them. those screw holes are slotted. I find if you press the bracket as far towards the end of the camera as they'll go against those screw heads, do them up tight. That tends to be the right position. Now the shutter cocking rack. Well, this I've got to look at closely because this is the one that I've had an attempt at straightening this one up, and I'm not sure how successful that will be. It's unusually tight here. Either the film advance shaft is pushed right over, or this screw is bent, and as a result it's pressed across too far. That screw's bent. I'm going to replace that with one that's not bent. And see how we get on. I mean, I can straighten things like that up, but I'd rather not have to. Now, there were two flavours of this particular screw. One had a slightly larger head here, so effectively pushed the rack further over. That was the service replacement used for cases where there was too much clearance. I put a standard one in here, and I want to see how the rack fits. It still doesn't want to fit into that space. That's very snug. It may be that I've got the whole film advance shaft pushed over too far. We'll leave that exactly where it is, I think. Because it is in place, I want to see if that action will move smoothly. So we have our clamp down bracket at this end. This is the post that the film release lever runs on. I've got a special screwdriver I've made here to hold that, to drive it. It's bored out and it's got a slot across the end to engage with that. There's certainly not excessive clearance between the rack and the gear. Alright, I'll put the strap lug on the end here. Now there was a spacer underneath that strap lug at that point. If this rack works very well, I won't need to replace it. If it looks doubtful to me, then I will. Racks, as you may well be aware, they're somewhat thin on the ground, in fact close to impossible to find. So I don't replace them lightly. When racks were freely available, I would have certainly replaced that one without any thought. Well, it moves smoothly. I've just brought the rack to part way through its action there, and I'm checking to see what clearance there is at the gears here. And it's very neat. There's no rattle. That moves entirely smoothly. That'll be fine. There's no problem there. That rack doesn't need to be replaced. I've successfully got that one back in working order. That seems very good. there's no excess play there at all. So that brings us back to that screw. And I've got a good one here as well to compare with it. I'm trying to see if I can see the bend in the screw. I certainly can. It's certainly bent. I don't know what happened to that. I've got no idea. I don't know whether somebody purposely bent that in order to get greater engagement between the rack and the teeth on the top of the gear. All of this didn't necessarily happen at the same time. Quite a plausible option here is that the shutter cocking rack had failed. Somebody, or was showing signs of failing, somebody bent that screw head across in order to push the rack into firmer contact with the gear, decided that was a waste of space at a later date and actually got a new rack in there, but didn't unbend the screw, and so that there was a problem left there. I honestly don't know. I know that that screw's bent. If that screw was rotated half a turn, it would have been well away from the rack. And we know that both screws were loose when I got into the top of the camera. And if it was well away from the rack, then the rack would push away from the gear teeth and the teeth would strip. However, we'll call this one a, at the moment at least, we'll call this one a win. That looks good to me. Everything seems to be working nicely in our film advance. And if I put the rubber band back on here so that my shutter release can't get away, I can close the bottom of the camera, put the leatherette in place. Now with the rack in position, the film advance can't wind down and lose the tension, so I can remove my film advance lever and glue my leatherette onto the base. Easy. So, first things first, everything's been cleaned within an inch of its life, but of course I've been handling the camera with my greasy fingers ever since, so there'll be grease on this chrome trim plate and I want that off, otherwise the glue won't stick. That's good. Well, here's our leatherette and it's all cleaned and ready to go. Of course we've got this residual hole where the screw had backed out of the door at some stage. I think I'll cut a patch into that. I think that's probably the thing to do. Right, I've cut a little patch out of a scrap of something I had, and I've cut a notch out of the base, the leatherette for the base plate. I'm going to glue those together, and then once they're dry I'll cut that back nice and trim, because I just want just a touch of glue here along the edges. So I will find the most appropriate adhesive. This is the same as that other adhesive I was using, but this is quite runny. It's obviously got a lot higher content of solvent in there. And being quite runny, it's quite thin. So I'll run some on that edge. And do the same for my patch. And if I'm very lucky, I'll be able to get the two mated together. That looks promising. So I'll let that set up for 5 minutes and then I'll trim it. Well, there's the patch all ready to go back on the camera really. That leatherette, that's all been, that patch looks quite good. I think we're in business. So I need to apply some adhesive to my leatherette and I'll apply it with a toothpick. I'll just put some onto the paper and then apply it to the leatherette with a toothpick in this case. Well, from this side I can't even see the patch. That looks good. Where's the camera? Now leatherette generally shrinks, so it doesn't want to fit neatly around a raised boss like that, so you may need to run around that to make sure it's seated correctly. Just rubbing away any excess adhesive here at the moment. Making sure it's well stuck down, particularly that area where I'd put that patch in, which is over here. But that looks good. That's a good result. Put the Film Advance lever back on. And I need to get the tripod socket surround and back catch release cover in place. So reassembling this. Well, the longer of the two slots got a small tab at the end, that's to hold the spring. So you put a screw up through there, support it with your finger from underneath. You can fit the spring between the screw and that little protrusion on the end of the slot. Holding that carefully, bring it up to the camera, get it seated in place and tighten the screw. Now if the spring had moved, if it was no longer in position, don't tighten the screw up. If you have any reason to believe the spring has moved, just stop and do the whole job again. Because if the spring gets trapped underneath, it will get damaged. So I put one screw in, checked, made sure that swung neatly, put the other screw in, check again, tighten both screws. That's the base of the camera dealt with, except for the patch here, which was missing. That was missing on that camera. So I've got to get one. Now I've got one here partly cut out on this piece of leatherette I see. So I'll trim that out and we'll use that one if it's going to be any good. Well, that's all in place. So basically that's the camera body finished. Apart from the stuff that goes on the top, the rangefinder and the meter and the top cover. So I better start cleaning those up. Well, the top cover looks quite tidy. I removed the shoe to make it easier to clean the top cover. Taking great care not to slip with the screwdriver and damage any of that chrome. The windows at the front here, they'll slide out, so I'll slide those out so that I can clean them. It's interesting, this top cover, someone's painted it black in here. It's just a wash of paint. It's obviously not original because the rest of the paint here is matte black. That piece there is something else. It's like a gloss finish. It's very thin. I can only assume they did that to stop reflections in the finder. But that's not normally a problem with these cameras. However, let's clean up the top cover. That's the first thing to do. Whenever you're dealing with a camera that is 60 years old, it's got history. People have been in there and they've done things. It's very hard to second guess why they might have done things like that. I'm sure they had a logical reason for doing it, and perhaps it was the correct thing to do at the time, but there's no particular sign of why that would have been. Now, it may be that the finder really was suffering from lack of contrast because the finder needed to be stripped and cleaned. But instead of stripping and cleaning the finder, somebody tried to deal with their apparent lack of contrast by blackening out that tab there, thinking that the reflected light from there was the main issue. I don't know. It certainly couldn't hurt anything. I'm just not convinced it would be of much use. Alright, that's quite good. Now this window here needs to be cleaned with glass cleaner to get that meter window. Get that clean and clean the eyepiece at the back. Now the eyepiece at the back, you'll see it's got two nice flats on it. They're not for putting your crescent spanner on. This does not unscrew. It's riveted in here. That is so that you can fit a right angle finder. This window is apparently quite clean on the top surface, but the underneath surface is quite hazy. I don't know whether that's adhesive solvent on there or grease or what it is that's causing that problem. Well, that's an improvement. It looks like it's grease to me. It's very hard to get a piece of glass like that sparkling clean if there's any grease about, because it's in a frame, and if there's grease in there, the grease is also in under the edges of that frame and will instantly find its way onto your cleaning swab as soon as you get near it, and you just spend forever chasing smears. Oh, that's a vast improvement over what it was anyway. Of course, the eyepiece is always going to be worse on the outside where thumbs get to it. The inside surface is often quite good. And here this is just a plain piece of glass, so you aren't going to do much damage to it using window cleaner. That looks good. Now the frame counter disc here is a bit grimy. See if I can get that a bit cleaner. Generally, of course, that's just a cosmetic defect, but you can get so much grit under there that the frame counter doesn't want to move. This one moves without any problem at all. But if it is clogged with grit and dust and dried grease, that causes an extra load on your shutter cocking rack, because the shutter cocking rack also moves the frame counter, and so it's important that this moves freely. That appears to be quite good. Well, I'll clean that shoe and its screws and clean the glass, and that's the top cover dealt with then. I'm not so sure about the state of the frame counter on there. It looked to me like that the adjustment was right out at the end of the range. So I don't know whether that's going to be correct or not at this stage. Got a light corrosion on the threads of those screws, like they've been wet at some stage. There certainly wasn't any severe pitting on the camera top or anything. Okay, well that's all good. Here's my viewfinder windows. I'll have to clean these and put them in place.